Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Caffe Lena. Thank you so much for tuning in tonight. It is the fourth Tuesday of the month, which is our monthly storytelling night. And even though we can't all be together for our open mic part of the event, we've got three amazing tellers that help make this event possible every single month. And we hope that you'll donate to our virtual tip jar. All of the proceeds help to save Caffe Lena's stage and support these amazing storytellers. So thank you all so much for tuning in, and let's give a very warm welcome to Janine Laverty.
Oh, the deafening applause. Wonderful. Thank you, Carolyn. And Margaret French and Christie Keegan and I have been emceeing the storytelling open mic for years and years. And this is the first time that we've done just a storytelling program together. I shouldn't say just, you know what I mean. And it's very exciting. You should have been around while we were rehearsing and telling each other endless stories, but not all the ones we're telling tonight. I'm going to start with a story that comes from Liberia. It's a folk tale. Not so very long ago, or so very far away, there lived a man who had more than anyone else. His lofts of his barns were full of rice, and the compound was thick with goats. The round houses in the compound made comfortable homes for his faithful wives and his healthy children. He had only one problem. He was always cold. He bought so many bed blankets he could hardly breathe under them, but it didn't help. His wives took turns sleeping warmly next to him, and they put warm stones at the foot of his bed. Finally, when nothing worked to get him warm, he said, I have a sickness. I have to go find a healer. I am the wealthiest one. Surely I can find someone I can pay to heal me. And so he traveled. He went from one healer to another, until finally, as happens in these kinds of stories, he came to the oldest and the wisest of the healers. I am so cold. No one is able to help me be warm. I can pay you anything if you will heal me. The wise old healer looked at him and said, "You said you have more than anyone else. Have you not learned that people have sometimes hatred for those who have more than anyone else, especially if they're hungry? I'm sorry, but that is the problem you have. You have named my illness, but you have not cured me. I cannot cure you. You have to cure yourself. You must give away your wealth." The man felt even colder when he heard those words, but he was so starved for being warm that when he got back to his compound, he ordered one of his lofts to be opened and given out to the hungry hands outside. He was still cold. And so he ordered a second, and then a third. But none of these empty lofts brought him any warmth. And finally, as his teeth chattered, he ordered that all the rice be given out except enough for his family, his children, and his wives to last to the next harvest. There was hardness in his heart as he saw all this rice going out into hands. Hands he didn't know or want to know. Even now, he was so cold that his bones shivered and his teeth shattered like a calabash with dry seeds rattling inside. That old man tricked me. I will see the end of him. And the shivering man ran on those trembling legs as fast as he could go. The old wise man was in his hammock, stretched between the eaves of his round house. He sat up when he heard the man come chattering and roaring into the compound. I have given all of my rice away, except barely enough for my family and myself. And yet I am colder than ever. Did you give brotherness with the rice? Said the old man. Brotherness? No. I was buying warmth, not giving brotherness. Well then, said the wise old man, I'm afraid that you will die cold and poor. And so it happened that those who had been hungry had enough to plant and enough to eat. And they had enough strength to dance at the celebration of the cold-hearted man's funeral, the funeral feast. And even the sun that day, it is said, withdrew its warmth so that everyone would remember that brotherness is the only thing that warms a cold heart. So, thank you. We're going to move to our continent now and way forward in time to the work of Jean Robert Foster. I realized this week that her birth and death dates are almost the same as my Iowa grandmother's. And so I thought that was a perfect discovery because I guess I can think of Jean Robert Foster as my Adirondack grandmother. I didn't grow up in the Adirondacks. But the wonderful thing about stories from your grandmother is that you get 2 generations back from her. So this is a story from Jean Robert Foster, and it's about her father. Her father's name is Francie. Francie Oliver ran the farm while his father lumbered to support the 5 children he had fathered and the wife he had married who was from down below, maybe Glens Falls, and who didn't work out like the other farm women. Now, Francie was the oldest, and by the time he was 12, he could plan the crops and plant like a grown man. But there never was enough. Francie's father wasn't thrifty. And so Francie turned drover. Every summer, Francie would gather the cattle from all the neighboring farms in the Landon Hill area, and he would drive them down to Glens Falls to market, walking the 31 miles down and then walking back. Now, he walked slowly because he had to deliver all the cattle, the dry cows, the ones that were soon to have babies, the steers, the yearlings, any that the farmers in his part of the country had decided to send. He had to deliver them as sleek and fat as they were when they left home. So they had to stop to drink and graze along the way. Then when Francie got the cattle to the market, he would collect the prices and walk back home the 31 miles. I said to him, "Didn't you get tired and hungry?" "Well, yes," he said, "but when I got to Glens Falls, no, when I got to Chestertown, I would stop at Remington's store. You remember Remington's store? And I would buy some Jackson balls. I knew just how many Jackson balls it took me to get to Glens Falls and how many to get all the way back to Landon Hill Road. I didn't stop at Chestertown again. I didn't need as many to get back home because then I didn't have the cattle and I could walk faster." Do you know what Jackson balls are? They are round, hard balls of white candy, white with a red stripe, peppermints, and they last a long time on the tongue. I never drive over Landon Hill Road, but what I see that shabby 12-year-old in my mind's eye. I see him keeping the cattle in line for the long walk. And I remember those Jackson balls. Just a few pennies worth to keep him going on the trip. And his measuring the miles by their lasting. That's Jackson balls. I'd like to tell you a story now that I wrote from my experience working on the Denison farm. Some of you know that I've been eating the major part of my diet from the land on that farm since my 37-year-old was in 2nd grade. This story happened just about 10 years ago when I was working. It was somewhere in the middle of the 8 years that I actually worked on the farm after I retired. And at that time, there were 2 seasonal Jamaican workers working on the farm. Now, there are 4 Jamaican H-2A workers who come and spend the harvest, planting, harvest, the season usually from May or June until November, before they go back home to Jamaica. So this story's for them, for Walter and Errol, and for Tyrone and Marlon. One afternoon, after work on the farm, I was sitting on a canvas camp stool. It was a week not unlike this one that we've just had, hot and humid. And I was sitting where I thought there would be some birds, because I had a class assignment to watch birds, to draw them, to observe them, to journal about them. Walter and Errol came roaring up in the van. They were surprised to see me there because it was after 5 o'clock. Now, Walter and Errol liked to get in as many hours as they could before they went home. But the American workers on the farm, we stopped at 5, and then Errol and Walter went on working longer, and they were just coming back from the last job they usually did every night, picking zucchini. Surprised to see me there scratching away at my mosquito bites, Walter braked. Errol jumped out and came around, and while asking me questions about what I was doing, he picked up my binoculars and sighted on them, and then he oriented himself with my compass, jumped back in the van, and Walter floored it, and off they went to the barn. The next morning, Walter came over and he said, "Gwagwangeline." Walter always gave everybody a different name. He still does. You know, if you want to see birds, you need to be by the wetland where the cattails are, between the barn and the greenhouses. Of course, Walter and Errol lived on the farm 24 hours a day. They knew where everything was and everything that happened when the rest of us were home. So that afternoon, after lunch, when we were heading out to weed carrots and pick green beans, besides totes and tools, I threw into the van my notebook, my canvas camp stool, and my colored pencils. By the time it was just before 5 and we crossed the river, heading back up with the harvest to the barn, I saw them. I looked up and Walter came to a halt so I could get out. The sky was filled with swirling and diving swallows and maybe red-winged blackbirds. I jumped out and pushed the van door shut, and Errol called out, "Janine, the bugs are going to eat you alive." But no, the birds were eating the bugs alive. It was so satisfying. When I sat down in the middle of the goldenrod on my stool, sitting, the goldenrod was way up over my head, but I hardly looked at those blossoms because it was so beautiful to watch the birds swirling. They would come low over the cattails and fly way out over the sweet potatoes and the melons, and then swirl high again and then down. And then I noticed that underneath all this swirling glory, there were dragonflies. Now, they were not swirling in curves. They were all business. East, northwest, straight lines, angles. It was joy versus patrol. I can't do all that with both hands. don't know when it had started because we'd been away in the field, but now that I was sitting and had my clock, I could see that suddenly at 5:25, there were no more birds in the sky. I don't know why. Maybe their bellies were full, but maybe it was the light changing as the sun sank over the hill that was the boundary of the farm. So without birds in the sky, my eyes came down a little bit to the golden flowers of the goldenrod over my head. And for the first time, I paid attention. There were so many pollinators working those goldenrod flowers. Bees, green flies, and the bees were kind of humming calmly, while the green flies were buzzing sort of frantically, I thought. Buzz, 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 buzz. That went on, and then my eyes went down further to the ground around my feet. Now, I know I'd been wiggling my feet around while I was watching the birds and then maybe the pollinators. But now that I looked down, I saw that there were small insects around the stems of the goldenrod. Maybe they were, 4 to 8 inches from the ground. They were little insects. They were flying so much, I could only see kind of a rusty blur. But then as I quieted myself and kept watching, I noticed that even when they didn't seem to be alarmed by my wiggling, they were kind of flying in a sort of aimless way. My brain watched that and began to think, there's something familiar about this. And then I thought, lightning bugs. That's the way the lightning bugs used to kind of look in the backyard when I was growing up. You never knew where they would be next. Maybe they weren't aimless, but to my eye it seemed that way. By the time I'd figured that out, some of those insects were still, they'd landed. And I saw that they had striped underbellies, and they had butterscotch brown 2 wings in a parallel line down their backs. And at the tip of those 2 butterscotch wings were 2 perfect black rectangles. Later at home, I thought about how going to search for birds had brought me so many other observations, part of the system of that world on the farm. I pulled down my Peterson's Field Guide to Insects of North America, and I looked up lightning bugs. On the color plate page of the Coleoptera, there were my insects. The soldier beetle, it said, similar to lightning bugs, but, it was worth all the mosquito bites I got the day before. And that's the end of that story. So I'm going to say goodbye with the last Jean Robert Foster story that I'd like to tell. And this is for the buddies who work like workaholics at Big Bend. Some folks have strange things tucked away in their minds, rattling away in the corners. Now you take Milo Brown. He had something that I wish I had asked him about more when he was here on this earth. Oh, he had a name for it. He called it second wind. But there was more to it than the name. I really found out about it one day when we were haying and Milo came to me for a job. Now, usually we just traded work in the settlement, but I hired Milo because he was little and lean and scrawny, and he didn't own his farm or even his house. And he had a wife and a pack of hungry children. I wasn't sure that Milo could do the work of swinging a scythe all day long in the hayfield. But he said he could. So I let him start. Now we were mowing in the North Meadow, uphill, where the timothy stalks are so tough. And Milo held his end up pretty well until about 10 o'clock. And then I saw him sink down on a stump. Well, I stopped everybody then because my wife had sent some switchel out to the field, that drink that gives us all our strength back. And I went over to Milo and I said, Milo, is it too tough for you? Milo did some sweat mopping. It's tough, he said. But I won't know it once I get my second wind. Oh, I said, I've heard say of your second wind, Milo. Does it always come on time? It comes, said Milo, when I need it. The Lord made me lean and scrawny, but he gave me something. When I've used up all my strength, it's like there's a strong man inside me just saying, keep on trusting, Milo. I've trusted. My second wind's never failed. So Milo stood up then and he began to sharpen his scythe. I've always loved the sound of whetstones ringing out in the hayfield. And then Milo started in to mow again. And as we headed toward the top of the hill, Milo was ahead of us all, and he was laying a long, smooth swath, even and straight. And he wasn't nearly as bushed as everybody else when we got back down for supper that night. So I wish I'd asked him to tell me more about his second wind, because I could have used it myself many a time. So you have a chance to have a second wind and then a third wind tonight with Margaret and Christy, and I'm delighted to bring Margaret French up. And I'm so excited to hear a story from an author that I had never heard of until the first time I sat with Lena Spencer in her apartment on Broadway and looked at a whole collected works, volumes. They were kind of aqua-colored. Margaret.
I don't know what the number is. Okay. I was excited when I found out that Lena liked Stephen Leacock. And this seems like the perfect time and the perfect place to tell one of his stories. Now, growing up in Canada, Stephen Leacock was Canadian. I read a lot of his stories, and I liked them. In his day, which was the early 1900s, Stephen Leacock was immensely popular. I read somewhere that more people in this world knew about Stephen Leacock than knew about Canada. So it's fun to tell one of his stories. Now, this story is about a bank. Now, banks have changed a lot since 1910, when the story was published. Now, nowadays, we go to an ATM machine and we get money. Or we take pictures of a check and it gets deposited. And nowadays, the tellers are mostly nice. But in Stephen Leacock's day, banks were silent, cavernous places with a lot of dark wood and cold marble. And the tellers were men, white men, in dark suits. And they weren't particularly nice at all. The story is called My Financial Career. When I go into a bank, I get rattled. The clerks rattle me, and the wickets rattle me, and the sight of all that money rattles me. Everything rattles me. I mean, the moment I cross the threshold of a bank and attempt to do business there, I become an irresponsible idiot. Well, I knew all this beforehand, but my salary had been increased to $50 a month, and I felt that the bank was the only place for it. So I shambled in, and I looked around at all the clerks. I had an idea that a person about to open an account must needs consult the manager. I went up to a wicket marked accountant. The accountant was a tall, cruel devil. The very sight of him rattled me. My voice was sepulchral. Can I see the manager alone? Now, I don't know why I said alone. Certainly, said the accountant, and he fetched him. Well, the manager was a calm, grave man. I had my $56 clutched in a crumpled ball in my pocket. Are you the manager? I said. I mean, God knows I didn't doubt it. Yes, he said. Can I see you alone? I didn't want to say alone again, but without it, it seemed self-evident. Well, the manager looked at me in some alarm. He felt that I had some awful secret to reveal. Come, he said. And he took me to a private room and he turned the key in the lock. We are safe from interruption here, he said. Sit down. Well, we both sat down and we looked at each other. I found no voice to speak. You are one of Pinkerton's men, I presume, he said. Because of my mysterious manner, he had thought that I was from a detective agency. No, not Pinkertons, I said, as if I came from a rival agency. To tell the truth, as if I'd been prompted to lie, I am not a detective at all. I would like to open an account. I intend to keep all my money in this bank. Well, the manager looked relieved, but still rather serious. He assumed I must be a son of Baron Rothschild or a young Gould. A large account, I suppose, he said. Fairly large, I said. I proposed to deposit $56 today and $50 a month regularly. The manager stood up. He unlocked and opened the door. He called to the accountant, "Mr. Montgomery," unkindly loud. "This gentleman wants to open an account. He will deposit $56. Good morning." Well, I rose. There was an iron door open near me. "Good day," I said, and stepped into the safe. "Come out," he said, and he showed me the other way. Well, I went back to the accountant, and I took my ball of money and I poked it at the accountant with a quick, convulsive movement as if I were doing a conjuring trick. My face was ghastly pale. "Here," I said, "deposit it." The tone seemed to mean, "Let us do this fearful thing while the fit is upon us." The accountant took my money and he handed it over to a clerk. Well, the clerk had me write the sum of money on a slip of paper, sign my name in a book. I no longer knew where I was. The bank was swimming before my eyes. "Is it deposited?" I said. "It is." "Then I want to write a check." See, my idea was I would withdraw $6 for my present day use. Well, someone came and gave me a checkbook, and someone else showed me how to fill it in. I wrote something, and then I thrust it at the clerk. The clerk looked at it, and he said, "What? You want to withdraw it all?" Well, then I realized that I had written 56 instead of 6. It was too late now. There was nothing I could do. It was impossible to explain. And I noticed that all the other clerks had stopped writing and were looking at me. I plunged forward. "Yes, I want to withdraw it all." "You want to withdraw all your money from the bank? Every penny? Will you never deposit any more?" "Never." See, I was hoping that he would think that something had happened, that I felt insulted, and I made a wretched attempt to look like a man with a dreadful temper. Well, the clerk said, "How will you have it?" And I said, "What? How will you have it?" Oh, then I caught his meaning. In 50s, he gave me a $50 bill. And the six, in sixes, he gave me my money, and I rushed out of the bank. But as the big door closed behind me, I caught the roar of an echo that rose to the ceiling of a bank. Laughter. Well, since then, I bank no more. I keep my cash in my pocket, and I keep my savings in silver dollars in a sock. Thank you. My next story, as it happens, turns out to be about money too. Purely coincidence, or else money is on my mind a lot. I'm not quite sure which. In 1961, I needed a summer job. Oh, I'd been accepted at a fancy university down east, and it was going to pay for my room and board and tuition and books, but I'd still need money for the train fare and for expenses. Lucky for me, I had family connections. My mother was head secretary at the purchasing department at the University of Alberta Hospital in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. She knew everybody, and what's more, everybody knew her. My mother could walk faster than most young men can run. My mother came early. My mother worked late. And my mother knew, because she was friendly with the head of housekeeping, that there was a job opening for a summer college student as a ward aide in the hospital operating room suites. And I got that job. Folding and wrapping doctors' gowns for 8 hours a day, to be sterilized, working in a small windowless room. Oh, it was a wretched job. I realized I needed to improve my job skills. We had an old Remington typewriter in the basement and a typing manual, and I decided to learn to type. And I got pretty good at FFF and JJJ, and I was even typing sentences a little bit. I never did learn numbers because they were really hard to reach and boring. And I didn't learn how to use carbon paper because we didn't have any in the house. But I figured the next year I would be ready for a better job, especially with a mother who had connections. Well, the next year I applied for and got a job in payroll. My mother knew the head of payroll. And I think he assumed that I might be like my mother, fast and efficient. I wasn't, but he might think so. He asked me if I could type. And I said yes. He asked me how fast I could type. I had no idea. So I said 40 words a minute, which was probably not true. But I got the job. Now, the first day, the boss asked me to type a letter. He wanted 3 copies and an envelope. Well, it's not that easy. You've got to have 4 pieces of paper. They've got to stay together while you type them. And if you make a mistake, you've got to put these little pieces of paper. This was the olden days. And as for envelopes, they won't stay where you want them to be, and the address always turns out in the wrong place or at the wrong angle. And I kept making mistakes. And I wanted it to be perfect, so I would throw the wretched letters in the wastebasket. And by the end of the day, my wastebasket was overflowing. But I had created one perfect letter, 3 copies, and a perfect envelope. And I had corrected the boss's spelling. So he was really pleased that he got a perfect letter and somehow not concerned about my incredible lack of productivity. Well, within a short time, I probably got promoted. I took it that way. I got to use the payroll machines. Of course, nobody else wanted to use them, so that might have affected this, so-called promotion. Now, the payroll machines were these giant machines in a small room. I'd go in there by myself with a very long spreadsheet written out by hand in pencil. And my job was to enter all the salaries and all the deductions for all the employees in the hospital. And it was a big hospital. Oh, I love that job. It really worked for a person who's a little hyper-focused. Now, as an example of that, when I was a teenager, I melted 2 whistling tea kettles. Apparently, because I never noticed it happening, apparently they would start to whistle. I was sitting 4 feet away reading a book. And they would whistle and whistle and whistle until they got dry, and then they would melt. My parents would get so annoyed. I melted a couple of pots, too. But this job, this was perfect for somebody with my personality. I could take my time. Nobody ever bothered me, because if I made a mistake by even 1 penny, we would have to find it, and that could take a half a day. So they left me alone, and I would enter the numbers one by one, and it was great. Now, while I was entering all those numbers, I memorized all the salaries of the people who worked in the hospital. And then I came to realize that the salaries were not fair. I went home and I talked to my mother about it. I said, "Do you realize that housekeeper's starting salary is $150 a month, while janitor's starting salary is $300 a month? That's twice as much." My mother didn't move. I said, "It's not fair." My mother said, "Well," she said, "housekeepers only do dry mopping, and janitors do wet mopping, and wet mopping is harder." And I said, "Well, I am strong. I'd rather do wet mopping and make twice as much money." And my mother said, "You can't." She said, "Only men can be janitors." Well, that was not fair. Another thing I said, "Do you know how much RNs make to start off? Registered nurses who have to study for several years past high school, they also make a starting salary of $300 a month, the same as a janitor. And a janitor only needs an 8th grade education." And I knew that because I had also memorized all the letters that came from personnel. Well, justice or no justice, we had to go back to work the next day. And soon enough, I had to go back to school. But the 60s were a time when things were changing. Betty Friedan and Gloria Steinem. And women were starting to think about, to talk about equality. Now, it isn't that nobody wanted to be equal before. Of course we did. But now it began to seem possible. Well, during that time, each time I'd see my mother, she would talk about her work. And she let me know that that office would not survive without her. She knew where every piece of paper was kept. She knew the order numbers for everything that department ordered on a regular basis. She knew the names of every vendor. She was already ordering everything from syringes to toilet paper. Well, she said the secretaries, besides her, the secretaries were all useless, and so were most of the buyers. The only one who did anything worthwhile besides her was her boss. Now, she liked Mr. Beaton. He was such a nice man. Mr. Beaton always remembered her birthdays and Christmas. He always invited her to his Christmas party. Mrs. Beaton was a lovely woman, too. And the time passed. Well, after I graduated and came home, turns out there was a job posted. A job posted for junior buyer. My mother was furious. She said, "They've posted a job for junior buyer, and you know what's going to happen? They're going to hire some young guy right out of college, knows nothing. They're going to ask me to train him, and he's going to end up getting a lot more money than I do." She said, "I have half a mind to apply for that job myself." And she told the girls at coffee break. And they all said, "Faye, you're right. It's not fair, and you really are qualified, and you really should apply." And she thought about it. She thought about it every day. And she thought, well, it would be so hard for Mr. Beaton. You know, he was such a nice man. And it would be very hard for him to tell her that she couldn't have the job because she was a woman. She didn't like to make him feel bad. And then there were the people who would say, you know, who does she think she is applying for a job as a buyer, taking jobs away from men? She's this middle-aged woman. What a lot of gall she has. But on the other hand, she knew she could do that job. And this went on day after day. Finally, it came to the day before the deadline was for job applications. She was having coffee with the girls, and she said, "You know, I could do that job." And they all said, "Faye, you could. You really could. You really should apply." And then she said, "You know, I think I will. Let them tell me to my face that I'm not qualified." And she marched herself down to personnel, human resources, and she got the papers she needed, and she filled them out, and she plunked them down. And then she marched back to her office. Later that day, her boss came to talk to her, and Mr. Beaton said, "Faye, I hear you applied for that job as a junior buyer." And she said, "Yes, I did." And he said, "Well, it's about time. We wanted you to apply for that job. We were going to suggest you did it. If you hadn't, you know you're qualified." Well, she got the job, and it made a difference. She got more money, which was nice. And she got more money when she retired, which was very nice. And it made a difference in how she felt about it. As for me, I'm proud of my mother. My mother, Faye Marston, was the first woman buyer in the University of Alberta Hospital in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. Thank you. And now I have the great pleasure of introducing Christy Keegan with her wonderful stories and her passion for the environment and people and social justice and animals, especially dogs. Christy.
Thanks, Joe. Thank you, Margaret. Thank you, Janine. I am so honored and thrilled to be able to tell with the two of you, and that was a wonderful collection of stories. Thank you. Well, we have been far afield, and we have been close in time and far away. This particular piece, the first piece I'm going to tell you, happened about a mile from here, about 20 years ago. Margaret is right. I have a real passion for animals, dogs in particular, but also cats. It was a cool, overcast day in early May, just a little bit after lunch. And I pulled into the parking lot of the Wesley campus to see my friend Andy, who lived there now. And I pulled into the last slot in a long row right near the front door. And as I did, I glanced to my left. And I saw, sticking out behind the tire of a car, a small, wiggling tail. It didn't really look like a squirrel tail, but I'd certainly seen some pretty sorry-looking squirrels in the city, so as it flicked and flicked, I was sure it must be an injured squirrel, and I reached into the back of the car for the blanket and box I keep there for just such an occasion, and thought I'd have to decide to either have it euthanized or take it to a rehab. So as I headed down the row between the cars, a car pulled in right in front of the car that the little creature was behind, and 3 people got out, 2 men and a woman. And as they walked around the back of the car, the tail slowly turned, and instead of a squirrel was a small kitten. It lifted up its paw at the 3 people as they walked by. They looked at it and kept walking. I sped up my pace and started to kind of jog down the middle of the 2 lanes of cars. And as I did, a car passed me very close on the left and pulled in right on the other side of the kitten. And I was sure that they might actually run her over. And so I ran up to her. And as I did, a woman and a man got out. And the woman walked past the kitten, looked down at her, and stepped over her in her high heels. I was floored. What kind of people were these? I got to the kitten, I picked her up, I held her close the way you do with kittens because they're so cute, and oh, God. No wonder her tail looked so bad. All of her, she'd been covered in gasoline, and her eyes were squeezed shut against the fumes, and her little mouth was panting. I took the towel out of the box and wrapped it around her neck to protect her from the fumes and ran into Wesley. It was almost 20 years ago. I didn't have a cell phone. Nobody I knew actually had a cell phone back then, and I was there often enough the woman at the reception desk knew me. As I headed through the door, I ran into a nurse who was running out holding a kitten who looked very similar, this one with a broken leg and also coated in gasoline. She had caught her in the parking lot, apparently the sister of the kitten I was holding. My vet just said, get here as fast as you can, and so I did. I don't think I broke the land speed record, but I will tell you that I took stop signs and red lights as suggestions, not actually absolutes. I got to Stillwater in far less time than I ever had previously, and the vet took the kitten, dumped her in warm, soapy water, and started to scrub. The next bath, the tech took over and did the same. And the third bath was my turn, a little bit of Dawn and warm, soapy water, and I massaged her and massaged her and massaged her, and finally most of that gray was gone. She was white with a little gray mark on her upper lip and a little one on her forehead. And I could tell, even though she was wet, that she was going to be fluffy. So the vet wrapped her up in a towel and handed her to me and said, well, now what? I hadn't actually thought that far ahead. I lived in an 800-square-foot house with 3 Doberman pinschers, totaling about 270 pounds of dog. An additional 25-pound mixed breed, Sato from Puerto Rico, and a 20-pound Bengal cat. I thought, I don't have room for another animal. But just as I thought that, I looked down, her beautiful little yellow eyes looking up at me. "Oh, I'm sure we can make room for her," I said to the vet. And so, thermometer was stuck up her butt, and needles stuck into her body, and her teeth were checked, and her abdomen was palpated, and by the time we were done, this poor little thing was exhausted. And I tucked her deep inside my sweatshirt and zipped it up to keep her from the kind of cool air. At this point, it was late in the afternoon, and she was still damp, and I drove home. I walked in the house, let the dogs out back to run around the yard, and then one by one, as they came in, I introduced them to the kitten. Well, first Ruby, my oldest Doberman, who loved all cats, and just licked the top of her head and walked by. Next, Katie, my youngest, who was all out goofy but liked everything and licked the top of her head and walked by. The Zara was uninterested but not harmful. And then from on top of the refrigerator, Chewy, my Bengal, jumped down onto the counter and onto the floor and came over and stood up on his hind legs and sniffed her. "Oh, it's a girl. It's a girl," he said to himself. You could see it in his eyes. And he pranced off, incredibly pleased. He loved other cats. I walked into the living room and sank down into an armchair across from the couch, and my largest Doberman, Ebony, came in and lay on the couch. I took the kitten out of my sweatshirt and began to pet her, and she began to purr. And Ebony realized there is a foreign creature in the house. She suddenly, 98 pounds of Doberman, came roaring at me across the room, her teeth bright white against the red of her lips and her shiny black fur, and this horrible growl emitting from her throat. And I put up my hand and my leg. "Ebony, no, no, no." Too late. The kitten launched herself at the dog's face, and I noticed suddenly the sides of my still damp kitten turning faintly pink, and I thought, oh my God, I am the worst animal owner in the world. How will I explain this to the vet? My kitten's disemboweled. I grabbed her by the scruff of the neck, and I began to yank on Ebony's collar, and finally I popped them apart, screaming at her, "Let go." I rushed into the kitchen. I turned on the water. I took the sprayer. For the 4th time that day, sprayed this poor little kitten and checked for holes, but there were none. There was no blood at all. I wrapped her up in a big linen towel really tightly, like swaddling, stuck her back in my sweatshirt, zipped it all the way up except for her nose, and went into the living room to check on Ebony, who was sitting on the couch with her eyes slightly crossed, looking at her muzzle, which was leaking sort of like a tired lawn sprinkler. Little holes ran up her muzzle and across her nose, dripping blood. Even her lower lip had been lacerated by the kitten, who, quite frankly, had had it. It was a really bad day, and she was so over it. I leaned over to check on Ebby's injuries. At that point, the kitten pitched her little head out of the top of my sweatshirt, and Ebony immediately shoved her face underneath the sofa cushions, which is basically where she stayed for weeks. I managed to clean her up enough and get triple antibiotic ointment on her, and nothing festered. The kitten was very much at home. As tiny as she was, she would walk from the kitchen through the dining room and into the living room, and all of the other animals would greet her. And she would walk right past the couch where Ebony had taken up a permanent station. And every time she did, she would stop. And she would look Ebony in the eye, and Ebony would shove her face underneath the couch cushions. This went on for months. I think the cat was probably 7 or 8 months old, and coming into her own, she was large and fuzzy, with lots of fur between her toes and an enormous great tail and kind of a big pink belly. And I came home from work one day, and there she was, the kitten, who I'd named May because I found her in May, was lying on the couch on her back. And Ebony was lying on the couch with her head on May's stomach. May had her paws wrapped around Ebony's muzzle and was licking her nose. And that was how the two of them slept for the rest of their lives together. Now, I named May not only for the month, but for my grandfather's sister, who was kind of the family rebel, an artist at a time when artists were kind of suspect, and who went off to live with a man without benefit of marriage. And I kind of liked the idea that my feisty kitten would be named after her. But about a year after I got May, I told this story. And two little girls who'd been in my Sunday school class, two small Chinese girls who friends of mine had adopted, came up to me. And the youngest one was just 4. And she said, "Not May, May, which means little sister, which is how her name got changed." I do miss my cats. This next piece took place a little further afield in the Bronx, in the South Bronx, where I spent a great deal of time as a kid. And close to, actually a little more than 60 years ago. In 1959, in the spring, I was just shy of 9 years old. And I was walking with my family through Kings Park in the Bronx, something we did often on Sundays when we visited my grandparents. It was shortly after Easter, judging by the new clothes we all had on. And I remember thinking, in a way that 9-year-olds do, how pretty we were. My grandparents were ahead of me on the left and my parents on the right, and my little sister Marcy and I trailed behind, dividing our attention between whatever the grown-ups were talking about, which was mostly not interesting, and looking for 4-leaf clovers. My grandmother was so pretty, in a pale gray silk Shantung suit with a crop jacket and black patent leather high heels and a black patent leather bag that hung from her elbow and little white gloves, the left one of which was in the crook of my grandfather's elbow. He in a dark gray flannel suit and shiny black shoes, a camel's hair coat and a fedora. And my grandmother had a wonderful frothy gray and white flowered hat with a short veil. My father was less formal in a sports jacket and slacks and loafers, and he carried my little sister, who'd been born the previous November, slung over his shoulder, kind of like a sack of potatoes. And my mother, the prettiest of all, in a slim black suit, kind of boiled wool, short jacket, jet buttons, a little bit a la Chanel. She had on red alligator high heels that I envied, and a red alligator purse, the clasp of which was the head of a small alligator that clip, thwacked shut really satisfyingly when you closed the purse. She had on red lipstick and red nail polish and a short bob, and I just thought we were all that. Well, we walked along through the park, and suddenly I saw a man coming kind of across the lawn towards my grandfather, and as he got close, he took off his hat, which is what men did in 1959. And I assumed, since my grandparents, between them, knew almost everybody in the South Bronx, that he would soon stick out his hand and say, "Hey, Jack, hey, Marie, how are you?" But instead, he grasped the brim of his hat and turned it and kind of looked down as he shuffled closer to us. I was curious, so I dragged my sister a little closer, close enough I could hear him say, "Could you spare a little something for a man down on his luck?" Well, my sister and I looked at each other. My grandfather was the definition of a soft touch, not just for his grandkids, although he certainly was for us, but for anybody who needed something. He was a union steward for the printers union, and he was the man, he was the go-to guy. If you needed money for rent, if things had run low, if you needed food, when the union went out on strike every other year at Christmas, he was the person who made sure that everybody got presents. I was sure he'd give the guy something. But instead, he yelled at him, "Get away from my family, get away, get a job." Even more astonishing to my sister and I, who had never, ever heard my grandfather raise his voice. The man backed up a little, but my grandmother stopped my grandfather. So many unheard of things. We had never heard my grandmother disagree with my grandfather. Not that she always agreed with him. She just knew how to agree with him, so he agreed with her. Jack Keegan. What if that was my brother, Austin? What if he was somewhere asking people for help? Would you want someone to treat him like that? Austin was my grandmother's brother who'd gone missing during the Depression. He'd gone to ride the rails out of Wilkesboro, Pennsylvania. And my grandmother had gone to 7 a.m. Mass ever since, praying for his safe return. My grandfather looked at my grandmother, "Marie, don't be silly. Don't be silly." And then my father chimed in, as if suddenly he had just met his mother. "Mom, come on, that's crazy. Don't be giving Dad's money away." And then my grandfather said, "Maria, I work hard for my money." That was a mistake. My grandmother's a seamstress and a milliner from Maine Boucher, one of the biggest design houses in New York. She probably earned more than my grandfather. She drew herself all the way up to 4'11" in her 2-inch heels, looked at my grandfather and said, "So do I, Jack Keegan, so do I." And she flicked open the clasp of her purse, and she took out her change purse, and she flicked that open, and she took out a dime. Now, a dime in 1959 was not nothing. It got you a cup of coffee and a piece of pie. And then looking deliberately at my grandfather, she put the dime back in and took out a quarter, good for a meal. And she handed it to the man, who took it somewhat nervously. My father sort of sputtered, "Oh, come on, Mom, that's crazy." And my mother piped up, "Jerry Keegan, shame on you. What are you teaching our children? There is no us in them. You know that. There's only us." And with that, my mother opened up her purse, took out her change purse, didn't stop at a dime, and handed the man a quarter too. There is no us in them, Jerry. It's only us. If you forget that, we are all in trouble. And then we walked off. That was a phrase I heard probably every day of my life. My mother said it to us when we fought with each other. She said it to us when we fought with the neighbor kids. She said it to us if there was a disagreement we somehow couldn't resolve and we were holding grudges. There is no us in them. There's only us. If you forget that, you're in trouble. If we forget that, we are all in trouble. Thank you. And now it's the close of our evening. And although I'm sad that Janine and Margaret cannot join me up here, I am incredibly happy to have everybody here, those of you who are here, join us, and those of you who are watching this live streamed, and to Caffe Lena for keeping this program alive. It has been wonderful doing it even this way. We hope that those of you out there who heard us loved it, and we hope to see you on the 4th Tuesday of another month. Thank you very much.